Welcome. You're listening to the ITOT Insider Podcast. I'm your host, David. Subscribe to get the latest insights shaping the world of Industry 4.0 and smart manufacturing. Today I'm pleased to welcome Gregory Grauwels. Gregory describes himself as an Industry 4.0 enthusiast, and we'll talk about that later in the podcast. He's the Group OT Manager at Cloetta. Cloetta is founded in 1862, is a leading confectionery company in the Nordic region and the Netherlands, so that's here in Europe. They are a manufacturing and marketing company who are producing confectionery, chocolate products, nuts, and much more sweet stuff. Gregory, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. So why don't we kick things off by your introduction, your personal journey?
Yeah, who's Gregory?
Yes, who's Gregory? Yeah.
I live in Belgium, so we have this a little bit the same background, that we come out of the petrochemical area where we worked, but maybe a bit before. So I started working actually as a freelance music producer. So during my studies, I played a lot with some music, remixing existing music, and that got out of hand a little bit, and I signed some contracts and traveled the world for 5 years nonstop.
Oh, wow.
So that was completely different. So, but there was a time that I came to a point I have to move back to my original roots, which was the hardcore engineering part, just the mathematical, technical stuff, and not the the artistic side of my life at that point of time. So I started working at an automation company as an automation engineer. So started programming PLCs, HMIs, SCADA systems, all the typical Siemens products that we usually have in Europe. And then I progressed to a bigger company called Bayer, Monsanto at the time. And there I was a digital manufacturing plant manager, so focusing on all sorts of industry 4.0 initiatives, so digital maturity assessments, but also cybersecurity and the MESMOM layer as well. So yeah, that was till I joined Cloetta, my current position. So went from a petrochemical industry to confectionery, which is completely different. So that was exciting.
I can imagine so. And I always like to explain a little bit, I would say, the different industries in the world. In this podcast, we are already at many. Actually, we didn't do a podcast yet on the chemical industry itself. So we actually might want to do a retake between the two of us. But this one is about confectionery. So what does it take to produce candy? How does a confectionery company look like?
So very simple. You put in raw materials, you process the materials, you mix it, you give it a color, you give it a smell, a taste, a form, and at the end, that's an eatable product. And that eatable product you package in all sorts of sizes and so on. So at the end, you go from raw material into a processing line to a sort of semi-finished conditioning stockage. And then from that on, you go into the packaging lines where you package these products, going on all sorts of packages and pallets and so on to all sorts of customers. So
does that mean, because you're producing a big variety of sweets, does that mean that there are a lot of different production lines. Is there, or is there some kind of a standardization? Is it possible to use the same line for different products, or is every plant, every line totally different? How can I, can you give me some insights on, I would say, let's call that scaling possibilities or whatever you want to call it?
It of course it really depends on what you're producing, but we call it technology, and that's a bit how to say fighting with my technology term in my mind. But technology that we have in our company is really the food technology. So how to make a certain product. So a technology to make wine gums versus chewing gum or versus jelly bean or chocolate is a complete different technology. So that comes with different machines, different assets, different lines. So it really depends. And that's interesting because a wine gum, I would say, at the base, it's you mix a lot of materials and you give it like I said, a taste and a color and so on and so on. But the end product can be completely different in a sense that you can put sort of salt or an oil finishing or like a sugar finishing. You can have it in different forms and colors. So you have all these kind of different things based on the same kitchen slab, we call it. So you can make it like very lengthy, like we call it in the Netherlands snoeren. But you can have it like stacked, like the English drop, the English licorice. So you have all these kind of different things. And then machines start mingling with each other. So production lines, we produce in one factory, ship it over and finish it in another factory. So it becomes quite a complex thing, I would say.
I can assume that for an OT manager, that creates quite some challenges.
Yeah, and it's old and it's new. So we have. You said it. We're founded in the 1800, meaning that we had lines from that area almost, in the sense that we have very old machines as well, creating a particular product, which was, for example, I think in the Swedish market, we had like mums and all these kind of things. We were very specialized sort of candy, well known in that area. And that's just like one old school machine, just making that particular candy. And now we have also the very fancy brand new packaging machines that comes with all the bells and whistles. That's excites me, of course, as well.
Can you imagine so? And if you have a machine, no matter how old it is, if it's performing, if it's doing what it has to do, then there is obviously no reason to replace the machine just for digitalization purposes, right?
No, of course not. And an asset delivers. You buy and engineer a certain asset to deliver a certain product. So if it's delivering, then that's it. So the data part and all the technology where I'm focused on, that's like the second stage. But
and something which is what I like very much in our domain is that we are sometimes talking about assets which have a certain life time, and they're already sometimes they are 10 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old. So now we're talking about assets which might be 100 years old.
Yeah, not anymore in Cloetta. Let's call it that. That was a bit. But indeed, all sorts of life cycles.
Hey, so you started as an OT manager at Cloetta. Now, in your previous role at Bayer Monsanto, you were dealing with digitalization more from a smart manufacturing point of view. So you weren't, I would say, is it correct to say that you didn't have the end responsibility around the entire OT domain within Bayer?
No, Bayer is a really huge company. So it's 120,000 people working for that company. And I was focusing on a particular segment. So Monsanto was focused on seeds.
Okay.
And then Monsanto also has a petrochemical part, which is making the Roundup, as we know it. So you have also the pesticides side. So you have different departments, different technologies at the end as well. So
you had a very, I would say, specialized focus probably. Now you changed over to becoming, the group OT manager of a company, a multinational company, with sites, with multiple sites. I think for our audience, many of them will be in an OT role. Some might change from being an engineer to an OT manager. Some might do that within the company they're working in. Some might join a new company. So I'd love to take, I would say, just one step back and go back to that original journey for you. What does it take to start as an OT manager within a company? In your case, Cloetta, but let's make it generic. So, what do you think it takes to when you start at day one, so to say? What are the steps someone needs to take when you enter this role?
It's a good question. Indeed, I've been progressing from like a project engineer towards more a manager, I would say, and now entering a field that's also sometimes, I think, unknown for companies. Like, what is OT in general? What is it? Because we are so used to have E&I and process automation in place, like PLCs and HMIs. But then, if you talk about MES, MOM, and infrastructure, data infrastructure, and databases, and all that stuff, then it becomes a bit complex, or you come more into an IT area. So what is an OT manager responsible for? And I was lucky, and that's why I jumped to this position, was that I could form that kind of position itself. And in my mind, I have 4 domains to focus on. So the E&I and so the electrical instrumentation and the process automation side, that's like, I think, a certain given. You buy machines, it comes with a PLC and an HMI. You need to plug it in the power, but also in the Ethernet with an Ethernet cable. So that's the baseline. But then you start using data and you want to have applications on top of it. So more plant-wide SCADA systems, but also a MES, manufacturing execution system. And the manufacturing execution system itself is very broad. If you talk about MES or MOM, you can go from left to right, from up to down. You can land everywhere, I would say. So what is then that area? And then a big part is also network blueprint. So what is the cybersecurity measures? How do you set up a proper network blueprint in your company, in your factory? Because it's a completely different ballpark than the IT world, I would say. You have very specific needs. And for example, a big difference is that we highly focus on human safety. And that's really key. Whether you work in petrochemical industry or in food and beverage, human safety is always key. And then you have your assets and you have your food safety, and that's really interesting. So petrochemical, I think the real focus was on human safety, because you're dealing with a lot of crazy products, while with food and bev, a candy will not kill you, but it's the machines, and you have these kind of things, and of course you have metal pieces that can end up in your food. So it's more the food safety that's really crucial for also your customers. So very interesting. So 4 domains: OT network blueprint, cybersecurity part. So if a supplier comes with its machine and has an Ethernet cable, or even the devices with 5G, you really want to avoid that one in your factory. But how do you connect it properly in a safe way? How do you have your applications running, like printing machines? You have your MES, MOM, like an OE application and all this stuff, and then your SCADA systems. So that's like the 4 domains that I identified as a focus point. And then I would say if you enter a company, then you first need to do a sort of situational awareness. So how do you become aware of what is alive and kicking in your factory, and where are the gaps, where are the opportunities? And most of the time, that's a proper way to do a digital maturity assessment. So, for example, understanding the maturity of PLCs, HMIs that you have in place. What do we do with the data? Do we have data historians in place? What kind of applications are they running in a factory? And then if you have to manage multiple factories, then you have to see the red line across these multiple factories. So are there common applications, or is it like all silos and every factory is on its own? So you have all these kind of complexities. And at the end, I think you start to form a sort of awareness and also feel the opportunities and the gaps that are there for the company. So then you can start building also your requirements, and you see where the gaps and opportunities are in your domains that you define. So are these opportunities in more the process automation level, or more in the top-down approach, where networking and complicated ERP integrations are necessary? So that's like that whole awareness creates then a sort of requirement, but also define the requirements, I would say, but also define a sort of strategic steer. And I think as an OT manager, I'm the end customer. So I have always been working as a sort of integrator, but working as an end customer and being in that position, you really need to define the right steer for the company. And that's a certain pressure, I would say, but also it gives you a certain edge to really try to find the best way forward for the company.
If I this might be a bit black and white now, but I'm gonna ask the question anyway. So I've seen a lot of maturity assessments on cybersecurity, on innovation, on whatever. Some of them are like questionnaires. Others are like spreadsheets who seemingly they have no ending, right? You go like, oh, another tab, another tab, another tab, another tab. How do you, if you do such a maturity assessment, and whether or not you're doing it in Excel in your heads or in something other, that doesn't really matter. But how do you balance such an assessment that it's not too complex, but it's kind of asking the right questions, but not too much questions. You don't really bother, I would say, the people who are working in the plants too much, but they are still triggered by your questions. I always find it interesting to figure out the right balance here. How did you? Was it also trial and error for you? Did you change in how you do such assessments?
Yeah, good question. I was lucky, I think, that during my time at Bayer, I was leading also the digital maturity assessment, but that was also with an external company and with a lot of knowledge coming from the company Bayer. So I got some insights in how to perform a digital maturity assessment very lengthy, and that's like a full week identifying all the key stakeholders and then having a proper discussion with all the stakeholders. So at the end, I think you need to spend 1 week at the factory just to understand how the factory is running, who are running it, and how do they run it. So just have an open question, and I think being on the shop floor and just follow a person and let them explain what they do, and let them explain the good things, but also the bad things, and where they see the opportunities, and what would be their wishes if they would be in control and could change stuff. So I think that's quite not going too lengthy and having all these kind of standards in place and then knock someone dead with the 10,000 questions, but just have try to understand what we are doing and why, and are there improvements and gaps.
But that's so important, and I fully agree. First of all, the fact that you need to be there physically on the shop floor, talking to people. Like there is no way you can do such an assessment from an office building over just a remote Teams session or from headquarters, because then you're missing out on so much, I would say, important insights. And also, what I also liked, and just want to repeat that because you also said, like, yeah, open questions, walk with the people who have to work with the solutions on a day-to-day basis, figure out what really, yeah, bothers them today, what is working well, what is not. Because here again, I've been in discussions where if you're talking just to the management level, they would go like, yeah, we have to capture that and that type of data. Why? Yeah, because we need to build KPIs, etc., etc. But if you then go to the shop floor, the operators go like, yeah, but this is just utter bullshit. I'm not. If I need to enter all these data points, first of all, why would I? and
Exactly.
secondly, how is it actually helping me my job? Question mark.
Yeah, and I think that's like you say, it's really key. At the end, OT manager, I'm really in service of manufacturing our factory plants, and my key customer is like an operator because he needs to do his job every day, and I try to provide him the right tools. And I can say this 1,000 times over and over again. Like, technology is not a solution, and so it's only a tool. It helps you, but it's only a tool. And for the maturity assessment, I really try to find the real issue. Not that the need is there or a wish list that you need to have a new car, but why is your current car not running well? So what is like the real reason? Is it like an organizational problem, or is that like a process problem? Do we do it differently in another factory? Why do you have the problem and that other factory not? So that's what you try to find out, and then only then you find out really the functional requirements and the technical requirements to define the right tool for it.
Couldn't agree more. And then, but then there is still this problem we call building a business case. Because at a certain point in time, and I fully agree with you, Gregory, I fully agree. But at a certain point in time, you need to get money. So somehow you need to convince management about the fact that spending is needed in one way or another. Do you have some insights to share on how you? So you've done the maturity assessments. You obviously then go back and you do your homework and you build some kind of a plan, some kind of a roadmap. Then at a certain point in time, you need to translate that roadmap into funding, into a project, into maybe in some organizations they prefer these big bang type of projects, which I'm not a big fan of, but I'll like to hear your opinion on that. Or you want to go for more a small scale agile approach, but with the drawback that you need to go typically back for funding multiple times, or maybe some kind of a hybrid approach. What have you seen in your career?
Both, I think, and that's really tricky because I would say technology is a tool and it's an enabler, but it's sometimes quite tricky to attach direct savings to an enabler because you enables the savings. So you need to believe in what you try to enable to get to the enablement. And so that's quite tricky. So there are a lot of ways how to define a business case and to define the return on investment and so on and so on. And so you can, for example, if you, and probably we go into that topic later, but defining the proper infrastructure and having a cost avoidance, for example, is a major thing. Then you still need to spend money, but you can do it for less money. or you can do much more for the same money. So it's the way how you see it. So it's the same like a business case where we say we can avoid X amount of FTEs, so X amount of people, but maybe you don't want to reduce your people. You want to give them better tools and enhance them and make them more efficient so they can focus on other stuff. So you can spin it in a lot of different ways. And sometimes it comes with a very big bang. Then, like a bigger company, like where I worked previously, that was a big bang. But my approach would be that you do it smaller, in a small scale pilot, and really drive the benefits, and then people will see the benefits, and then you get that pull from the factory, and automatically you will drive that digital transformation that you're seeking. So not enforcing digital transformation, but really let people drive the digital transformation effort.
It's also a bit where you have the I'm gonna say old school. I don't mean outdated, but I just mean old school, older ways of working within an OT organization. Used to indeed procuring assets with a long life cycle, designing, engineering, for example, PLCs, or you also talked about safety. So we really want to make sure that the programming code within these PLCs, or maybe even safety PLCs, is running perfectly, so to say. And once it's developed, typically it stays there for quite a while. Let's put it that way. Now, on the other hand, you have influences from the IT world. IT embraced this agility, scaling, DevOps type of mentalities already many years ago. When we see that IT technologies, but also I think IT mindsets is coming to the OT world. This is also something which is definitely driving Industry 4.0 type of approaches. How have you seen these IT technologies, IT approaches coming into the OT world?
Yeah, I think that's what's really driving me in the first place.
Okay.
I come from the typical automation engineering where you have this pyramid. So in every layer you have a problem to solve with a certain application. So and probably you stick with the same brand as well. So you can buy the whole product stack from one company and have an MES and then a PLC and an HMI and everything from the same brand. But at the end, you try to solve things, and the old school way or the old way was that it was solving a problem at a time, and then you got this stacked solution. But now we want to use data everywhere, and everyone needs to be accessing that data. And so what I really like is that image where we move away from that pyramid and go into a more networked structure architecture. Isa also shared that image, and I fully agree that you need to build the right data infrastructure. And for me, that's like event-driven architecture. So how do we leverage real-time data in the factory? And then you have these unified namespace principles that comes around the corner, but also like microservices. How do we become more vendor agnostic, create an open architecture, and every bit and piece we just can swap and replace and just play with it. And at the end, it will not impact the total, but still make it better. And having this really open infrastructure and driving real-time data, which is easy to maintain, but also needs to be secure, reliable, performant, scalable, all these kind of things. That's what's really keeps me going, I would say. So going from a PLC, HMI, installing a Windows server, installing SCADA, spending like 3 days installing applications, towards using Linux, Docker, one command, 5 seconds later, the whole architecture is there. So that's like amazing how we go from a old school server installation to, for example, Docker containers, installing software like Ignition, Kepware, installing brokers, HiByte, all these kind of functionalities, all these applications, all these technologies coming towards the industry. That's really what I love. Going really from, I think the industry always followed the big brands, and I feel a shift where the end user becomes the owner and decides what they need. Instead of buying the whole product stack, we're gonna decide where your product ends up in our stack, and that's what I really like.
Yeah, more this open, interchangeable architecture approach. So you mentioned the unified namespace as a concept, as a design pattern to organize all these bits and bytes, so to say. It's a concept I also like a lot. Now I can imagine that your approach when you, I would say, approach a brownfield versus a greenfield, is that different? How do you I would say apply new concepts, new ways of working, not only the unified namespace, but also new technologies to a brownfield plant? How do you, I would say, separate the things which are already there from what's new, for example? Or how would you do these types of projects?
It's a really good question because that's one of the key questions that I have to keep in mind as a OT manager. So if you want to form a strategy, you need to build a strategy that's for green, but also for brownfield. And so starting fresh, that's always, I would say, easy and nice, but having all the brown stuff in place and putting the same stuff on top of it or integrate it, that's the real challenge. But at the end, I think and that's why I like really technology-driven architecture. Um, it's like these microservices, and sometimes in a brownfield you already have pieces in place, and it's not that you have to swap it. You can just integrate it and you swap it with the one that you have in your strategy, I would say. And then you can make the case whether you should swap it or not. But at the end, the key question is, what are you seeking? So what are you trying to do? And the unified namespace is only, for me, it's not the answer. And so it's maybe I'm gonna uh, step on the tone, the step on the feet of Walker Inns, I would say, but unified namespace is not the answer. And so it's a tool as such, and I really believe in what a unified namespace is. But at the end, you try to seek something, and connecting your machines, whether it's old or new, connect them and collect the data, store it somewhere, visualize it, transform that data, and publish that in somewhere that everybody and everything can access to. So you have like a actual state of your business. That's like, for me, unified namespace.
Yeah,
But then you have a lot of complexities, and
of course.
that's really interesting. How do you set it up properly?
I'm sure Walker wouldn't mind that, that you're calling him out here, and it's obviously there is not a single technology or a single concept which is a solution to everything, right? That's maybe exactly the thing we're trying to solve here in this discussion, is how do we make sure that we combine the best of the best concepts from different worlds and merge them into each other. The thing which I also like, or I also see changing, is that, and so you talked about more the traditional stacks, the pyramid. I don't like the pyramid, actually. I never liked the pyramid, because the pyramid implies that somebody is on the base and somebody is on the top, and the top is always very small and the base is always really wide. So, but anyways, besides the visualization of the pyramid, there is another thing that's, let's call it open source versus closed source, or open source versus very proprietary type of software. I do see a lot of open source software now coming into the industry as well. And I see that, I would say, as it's positive, but it also has some challenges. So why do I think it's positive? It's because, well, the fact that you see what is happening, the fact that you can maybe contribute, that you have a community which can contribute, the fact that if a vendor would go bankrupt or cease to exist, that you would still have the source code to continue. And there are a lot of other reasons as well. But there are also some challenges because in many cases you can be on your own. You might not have a service contract to rely on. You might want to, You also have this again old school way of thinking versus let's try and see what goes on or what happens. At this point in time, I still find it difficult to balance out the role of open source software within any context, but especially here in an automation context. And I also love to get your insights on this topic. How do you balance this out? How do you make sure that if you are not there, that's and something goes on that there is still somebody to support?
Mm-hmm. Good question. It's a multi-layered answer, I would say.
I like multi-layered answers.
I'm gonna give it to you. No, so the first of all, I think you need to have a solution in place that's, like we said, it needs to be secure, reliable, performant, scalable, maintainable, all these kind of things. Mm-hmm. And how you do it, that's then the second question. And the how is in what kind of tools do you use? So it's not that an open source is less reliable than a closed one, like a monolithic solution. Mm-hmm. And open source is, there is a difference between open source, open, and more vendor agnostic, I would say, in a sense that I can fully agree with a monolithic kind of system to buy, as long as it's open. And that's the problem what we see with a lot of systems, that they create their own ecosystem, a closed ecosystem, and that's a problem for me. Mm-hmm. Because then either you have to pay a lot to get it open, or it's just impossible. Yeah. And if then a tool is open source and it's having the same, from a risk management perspective, the same level, I would say, why then not? It's not that it's open source that it's bad. I do believe that, and that's what I really like, for example, as a Walker Reynolds really pushing, is the land and expand model. Mm-hmm. So you need to be able to have first a transparent cost structure, because you have a lot of systems that you need to pay for a user, for a client, for a data point, for a server. So you have all these kind of complex cost structures, and you have no idea what you will pay in the end. Mm-hmm. And for me as an OT manager, trying to build a strategy and then being called out at a board meeting to say what will it cost at the end, I have no clue, because even the vendor cannot give me the final price, I would say, or it's like ridiculous expensive. So the point is that you need to be aware of the solutions best fit for purpose, I would say. And especially with the pilot, you can really use open source very well and very fast. Like if you just want to solve something, you can use like free tools like a Node-RED and whatnot, but also just having proper solutions in place with the trial license. So the land and expand. So you just trial the stuff, and you maybe reset it every 2 hours or a week or whatever. But at least your point is proven at that time. And then I think the other layer is your organization. I think that's really key, because how are you organized for handling these technologies? So if you're going to buy a new car, but you don't have a driving license, then you spend a lot of money for a nice car.
Yeah.
So you need to have, I think, in-house knowledge and expertise, but also outside your company, you need to have the right partners in place. So for me, that was really crucial to be knowledgeable from the inside, but also have the right partners to rely on. And all that together comes then to an open infrastructure. That's, I think, really key. That's the objective.
Yeah, I like the land and expand approach. I also have the feeling that sometimes we're talking so long about how to potentially solve a problem that either the problem becomes void or somebody says like, you know what, let's just keep on doing whatever we've done the last 10 years. But just trying it out. As a caveat, what I've seen with a lot of these projects is that, and I've been guilty myself. So I've done a similar thing. How long ago? Like 12 years ago at BASF. Just here is a simple solution which we're gonna use it just for a couple of months until we have something better. Now I know that thing is still running.
Exactly.
12 years later. So I do believe that you need, also within land and expand, you need a roadmap. You need to know like, okay, this has a lifetime of so long, and after that lifetime, either we need to kill it, or we need to build a service model around it, and that might, I would say, then you might wanna go for a product which with an SLA or some kind of a support model, or you still accept to go for a product which you need to support yourself, but then you also need to be the one who is on call 24/7, maybe. Yeah? How
Exactly.
do you have, how do you build these types of land and expand models within a multi-year roadmap? How do you make sure that you can also build an organization around it? How do you make sure that you're not just building loose elements?
Step by step. I think we're always very eager to know the end game. A typical financial person will ask you, what will it cost me at the end?
Mm-hmm.
But every time you have to say digital transformation is just an ongoing thing. So you're transforming. It's a moving part. So putting like an end number on it, it's just impossible. So you have to just take step by step and prove it. And while it's proven, then you get more traction, and that traction will solve then the financial part, etc., and the organizational part. Because if people see it and they really believe in it, then they will give you all the resources needed, whether that's time, people, or money. So I think that's what I really learned, focusing a lot on these fancy slides and like this multi-factory rollout and timelines. Then you come into that waterfall kind of thing, which we don't like. We need to be agile, we need to be flexible, and you don't know what you need or want in 3 years time. So maybe that can be completely different, something completely different. But by just step by step solving something, it will actually also guide you to a certain direction, I would say. But of course, you need to think about it. But I think the vision, I would say, should not be the path itself.
We mentioned Unified Namespace, we mentioned Walker, but we didn't really define the Unified Namespace yet, or at least your definition, because I have mine. There are a couple of on the internet as well, but I'd love to hear your, I would say, your take on what do you think a Unified Namespace is, and also what does a unified namespace concept, I would say, bring as value, or why should you go for that kind of design approach?
Good question again. Again, there are multiple layers on a unified namespace, but for me, it opened my eyes that you need to start collecting data and putting it in an appropriate hierarchy, I would say. And we all know the ISO 95. So you have like your site and your areas and your lines and then your units. But then it's an intriguing question. How do you solve then that hierarchy itself? So you have also functional domains within a line. And so you have like this raw data that comes in from all sorts of sources. You have like this functional domain where a lot of MES metrics lives, or like ERP master data that comes in. But you also want to collect status of your line or machine, production metrics, whether it's at a schedule or whatever you produced, consumed, wasted, scrapped, whatever. And also a lot of measurements, settings, maybe maintenance metrics and all that stuff. So at the end, you want to have all the information that is needed available in just a simple topology, I would say. And that's, I think, very key. And then the backbone, the technical backbone is how do you make that data available? And that's of course via a broker. So you publish that data and you consume data via a broker. And a broker is like this kind of place where you just throw all the stuff at, and it's living there at the center. And at the end, what you want to create is that you have this single source of truth, they call it, but at the end, it's really the actual state of the business, real time, and because it's not a data historian, it's just representing the data as it is now. So delivering an actual state of the business, I think that's really key. And once you have that data available, then you can do whatever you want with it. So then it becomes interesting. What are you going to do with it, with that data? And I think that's the key question. What are you going to do with the unified namespace? Because setting it up, I must say, it's quite easy. And so whether you use, for example, like an ignition, you have tag provider and you make this structure like UDTs or whatever, and you just publish it, even if it's if it's OPC UA or it's MQTT, whatever, the architecture is there. But with the broker and MQTT, you have these advantages of publishing and consuming data. But then how do you really form your ISO 95? Only that is like a massive discussion, I would say. What is a line? What is a unit or a cell? Yeah. So it's really stupid, but some companies it's a given. And I come from a petrochemical company where that's a given. You have PNIDs, okay, and then you have like a flow transmitter, and that's all sorted out. But then sometimes you also come in a company and you don't have that. So what is a line? Is that like a process line and a packaging line all at once because that's the line that's producing a product? Or do you say no, packaging is a packaging area and you have a process area and you have to shop maybe a direct line into two pieces? So that it becomes a bit complex. So and then defining all the data that's needed. That's like all these functional domains, and how do you give that a certain topology? I think that's very interesting. And if I may add, maybe for me crucial is that this triggers the way you think about data. Yeah. And that was for me really key. So instead of trying to find out what data is available, you come more into ownership and you define what data you need. And that's really key. You're going to define towards a supplier what kind of data that person or that supplier needs to deliver. And that's really key. So, for example, OE is a typical metric that you use, but what is the source data to deliver you the OE metric? And that source data, that data point, that's what you need. And that should be a given, that should be a requirement towards your supplier to give. And I think that's the key of also unified namespace, that you start thinking about what kind of data do I need to transform it really in information, so I can use that, bring context with applications or whatever to really get the actual state of the business, far more than just raw data points moving around, I would say.
I I like the concept, or I would say the brand UNS. But as you also said, in essence, it's not. I would say it's not new, right? We've been working around ISA 95 around data modeling for many years, and one of the things I always found very tricky indeed was to just come up with that data architecture. It's actually a data governance problem in a sense. And it's also something we're not really used to in OT. I think in an IT environment, you can't build an ERP system without having a data governance model. You have to define how an invoice looks like, and you have to define the fields on that invoice, and you have to define how an order looks like, et cetera, et cetera. It's the I would say it's the normal thing to do when you're building an ERP system. But for some reason, although data modeling has been around in the OT world for many years, for some reason it's still something new and we don't really feel too comfortable with that. Maybe a few tips on how to get started building such an hierarchy. How do you as I said, what do you need to go for the full blown model? Do you want to go for a very small one? Do you want to involve everybody? A few tips.
Yeah. So I think you can try to approach it from different ways, I would say, and I'll maybe come back to that OE metric. And so at the end, the whole OE metric is also availability, performance, and quality. And at the end, you only need a few data points to deliver these kind of metrics. And the point is that you have to decide what is really key for you. And so if that's an approach where you say that's a key metric and I go to the source of it, and that's like how I make a sort of template out of it, and that's what I need to get out of every machine, that can be then an approach. But I would suggest that you start small, because I built a whole UNS kind of data model with all the bells and whistles, but then and then you come into that brownfield, greenfield thing. You come to a machine that's maybe 60 years old, and if you're very lucky, you can maybe get one sensor. Sometimes you have PLCs that are just not open. You don't have the source data anymore. You don't have the program available. The supplier vanished. I don't know. It's an old school thing. So it's not always possible to get all the data out of it. At least, for example, a state would be nice, whether it's on or off, whether it's running or not, that would be nice. And if it's not running, why it's not running. Can you get certain alarms out of it? And for example, a PACML standard is a nice standard because it states like how you go from certain states and what do you need. So you also need like a speed. You would like to know how fast it runs. But again, a PACML gives you a certain standard, but it's quite empty. In a sense, a supplier can just fill it in however he wants. And that's a bit, I think, the pitfall of the standards these days. You have ISA 95, you have 88. I read them all, and I get like how to say, punthoofd in Dutch. We get like a very massive brain.
A massive headache or something like that, right?
Yeah, massive headache. Just by reading it, it's made for doctors. I don't know, but I'm maybe a simple guy, but just it's really nice to try to find a standard that fits everything, but at the end it fits nothing because it's not practical. So really try to find a practical way. Having just a few states in, but like an OE, just have a sensor that sees whenever a box or whatever material is coming along and passes that sensor. That sensor alone, that one data point, can give you the whole OE module you're seeking for. And that's, I think, really crucial, that you focus on these kind of things and not go after mean time between failure and all these crazy stuff, because at the end, you need to give some priority on what you really want to get out of it.
And
but
again,
at least building the model, I think it's nice.
And again, to come back to your previous point, your number one customer is operations anyway. So that means that what are the things you can do to help the plant produce what they need to produce in the best possible way, in the most efficient possible way, etc., etc.
Yeah, exactly. And just knowing the state and already giving you a very fast glimpse of what your line is doing, and all these sorts of things. That's like question number one. What do you really want to see? And then we'll figure out whether we can get that data. And if we can get that data, ideally you also format that in a structured way. You make a template out of it. So we call it a UDT. And then ideally you also make a visual component that's linked to that UDT. And all of a sudden you have like a template kind of SCADA available. And then once you go to factory A, B, or C, you just need to have a state, or you just need to have an OE sensor. And all of a sudden you have this whole application running by a few data points. And that's, I think, is key for a unified namespace, that you identify these functional domains with a few data points. And that's how you start building your whole unified namespace for the company. But don't try to already bridge PLCs with the cloud. If that's a need, fine. You can also have a business case that you just want to do predictive maintenance, but I think that will not solve the unified namespace principles for your factory or company, I would say. So you need to think bigger. It's how do you build the whole infrastructure properly?
Yeah, super interesting. There are a lot of things to remember from this talk. I remember step by step. Absolutely. Yeah. I remember land and expand. I really remember open architecture. Hey, it doesn't really matter whether you go for open source or closed source, but the open architecture, that's what the industry needs. And I fully agree with that. So with these three highlights, and there were many more, but with these three highlights, Gregory, thank you, very much for joining this podcast. I'm sure we will talk again in the future. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll be back soon with a new episode. Thank you.